Hello everyone! Today I'm going to be providing analysis on resolved endings in storytelling, separated into 5 main parts. In part 1, I will briefly explain why endings are so important in the world of storytelling, and then in part 2, I will describe my own personal set of principles that I believe should be closely adhered to for a resolved ending to succeed. The third part will then involve me analysing an ending that I think ticks all the boxes of this criteria, whereas part 4 will involve me critiquing an ending that, in my opinion, misses the mark. And then the fifth and final part will be my conclusion. Now, before we begin, just a small disclaimer. This may go without saying, but almost everything I say is 100% subjective. The last thing I want you all to take away from this video is that I am deliberately trying to come across as a condescending person who thinks everyone's views should just match theirs, because that's just not how the realm of creative media works. You know, you can dissect production, storylines, etc. But if there's one thing you can't dissect, it's pure entertainment. The reason why in the second part of this video I'm planning on outlining my own personal criteria is just so I can communicate the fact that I am comparing these stories fairly. That doesn't mean you have to agree with them, it's not objective, but it's showing you my consistency in evaluating screenwriting. So anyway, that's enough with the intro. Let's now discuss the important role that endings play in storytelling. Arguably, the most obvious and important job of any endings to any story is to evoke strong emotions from the viewer, and thus provide them the emotional send-off that they and the characters deserve. One of the worst signs of a conclusion is when it fails to make you feel, well, anything, as all that does is emphasize how bored you were, almost as if you wasted your time and will completely forget about whose journey you were even following in a matter of days. On top of this, I'd argue that making audiences feel a handful of different emotions has a greater chance of making us resonate with the conclusion to an even greater extent. Not only does this reflect how complex everyday human interactions are, but it can also retroactively add weight to events that came before. Say the good guys won after a conflict but lost a friend along the way. If anything, this makes their victory feel even more earned, as it much more explicitly communicates the stakes that were present. This feeling of sadness or regret expressed by one of the fellow protagonists could force them to go through an arc of, say, responsibility. This achieves the balance of adding a negative feeling, usually in the form of loss, while also not diminishing any feeling of success or satisfaction, as a range of emotions are more likely to make the characters more relatable. The third and final role I want to touch on is the reinforcement of themes. Now, since all stories should be trying to communicate some sort of message, I'd argue it's only fitting that all endings of said stories have an obligation to reinforce or recontextualize that very theme. Now, I've found that there are 2 theoretical benefits of this. One, it prompts audiences to look back on the whole story up until that point, which could lead to in-depth debates regarding the broader messages of said story, and thus go a long way in terms of full-time investment. And 2, it could excite viewers to the point where, even if the story wrapped up all of its plots and subplots, audiences are so invested in the characters and the universe they inhabit that a part of them really wants to be able to witness the protagonist's lives continue in a future installment. So now that I've provided some context on what viewers generally want to feel after most finales, I want to shift the crux of this analysis towards resolved endings, as in my experience of overanalyzing stories, not only are they by far the simplest to break down, but as the name implies, having access to the full story that takes place prior to it prevents there being any sort of uncertainty surrounding some character arcs or subplots that are currently on hold. But first, to ensure you'll understand my line of thinking, let's move on to my criteria for what I believe makes a resolved ending work. To put it simply, if you're unsure on how to determine the success of a resolved ending, I feel there are 3 key questions that need to be addressed. First, does the story resolve the overarching plot along with any supporting subplots in a satisfying way? This is an important ingredient for conveying how great of an impact the characters had on their surroundings, and thus makes the conscious decisions made by them feel like it wasn't all for nothing in the grand scheme of things. Even though most stories pull this off reasonably well, I think it's worth noting that a conclusion which frames the primary plot as a mild inconvenience takes away from the accomplishment we feel, because it instead makes us think how easy it was for the characters to end up triumphant, thus meaning there was no struggle. It was just a typical day for them, thus leading to the feeling of disappointment. However, the second principle asks, were all the major character arcs concluded in a way which reflects the themes that were prevalent throughout the story? That is to say, by the final scene, we should be well aware of how said characters have progressed throughout the story. Since tales from beginning to end are inherently told from the main protagonist's perspective, we gradually get invested in them, and thus come to care for their, flaws and internal growth on a deep level. In addition, because the main cast are our POV for the story going on, any thoughts that they express will almost certainly determine how we interpret the state of the world they inhabit. This is why we want our final memory with them to end on a high note, because it gives off a strong feeling of fulfillment and hope to those who connected with them. If done effectively, the contrast between the character at the end of their journey compared to the start of it can also help us look back on the story in a more fond light. This is largely due to the fact that looking back on scenes we've already watched, but now with a full understanding of its purpose in setting up the conclusion of said character's journey, recontextualizes the scene in a way that has us interpret them in a whole different light. As a result, the state a character's journey is left in can play a huge role in one's overall perception of the story. And on to the third and final question. Does the story provide certainty regarding the fates of the lead characters? Considering it is a resolved ending's job to evoke closure and satisfaction from their audience, I'd argue not addressing their current circumstance contradicts the whole point of a resolved ending to begin with, as all that does is raise more questions than answers, and thus creates the risk of leaving their fans more confused than satisfied. Because we have spent a reasonably long time getting to know and root for the main heroes, especially in multi-season TV shows, having little to no clue on their status opens up the risk of distracting us for the remainder of the story or the epilogue, as instead of resonating with the, supposed to be emotional payoff, the only thing that might be on our minds are queries and second guesses regarding the character's fate. While at first I thought this seemed fairly inconsequential compared to the other 2 principles, but upon reflection, I realised that failing to abide by this principle can have a ripple effect on how we look back on both the core themes and the purpose of the plot. This is primarily due to the character's importance in pushing forward both of these aspects in the first place. With all that out of the way, what I'll be doing for the rest of the video is applying this criteria to 2 different finales in an attempt to effectively communicate why one of them worked for me and why one of them didn't. All that said, let us proceed. One such finale that boils down satisfaction to its essence is the final episode of Gravity Falls Season 2, Somewhere in the Woods. Almost every fan of the series I've interacted with has listed this as a top tier episode. But why? Why does this finale stick the landing where others fall flat? What does this conclusion have to offer that a handful of others do not? Well, to explain this episode's acclaim as best as I can, I'm going to dive deep into how the series responds to the 3 questions I posed above. So without further ado, does the story resolve the overarching plot and any other side plots in a satisfying way? First, let's recap Season 2 real quick. The first half of Season 2 is dedicated to unravelling 2 mysteries: what Grunkle Stan was building underneath the Mystery Shack, and the identity of the author who wrote the 3 notebooks which kick-started the series to begin with. After episode 12, however, both mysteries were answered rather convincingly. So after putting these burning questions to rest, the plot of the remaining 9 episodes shifted to the gang's attempts to prevent Bill, an evil dream demon, from taking over the world. It's worth noting that some of the interpersonal relationships are linked to these storylines, Ford and Bill's history directly leading to the mysteries of the past and conflict in the present, Stan's 30-year-long effort to bring his brother back to his reality after their big fallout, the gang's conflict with Bill stemming from his initial invasion of Stan's memories back in Season 1, and so on and so forth. These examples I just mentioned are all contributing factors for our investment in a conflict's resolution, because by making the stakes more personal to the characters, they in turn feel more personal to us. So come the finale, how is this conflict with Bill settled? To put it simply, he gets erased by Ford's memory gun and the day is saved. Sounds pretty simple, right? Conceptually, maybe. In execution, absolutely not. The first praise I must give the resolution is its compliance to the rule of setup and payoff. Every feature, from Bill's power set, to his allies from the other dimension, to Ford and Stan's bickering, were established in previous episodes. Even details as little as Dipper and Mabel distracting Bill with their size-altering torch and grappling hook arguably enhances the conclusion, as their possession and skills with said items were established all the way back in the pilot. So when their diversion inadvertently contributes to Bill's defeat, our foreknowledge of Dipper and Mabel's capabilities makes the way the conflict reached its conclusion feel less abrupt and underwhelming. Moving on, you can have all the setup in the world, but if the payoff's resolution is disappointing, that risks fans retroactively looking back on the series beforehand in a more negative light. In Gravity Falls' case, if the season's main villain, Bill, was defeated too easily, this would arguably undermine all of the tension both before and during the finale, as making your villain look incompetent brings up the question of why we even treated them as a big deal in the first place. This also would have made the hero's win feel less like an accomplishment, as their actions would not have contributed to their victory, and thus their spiritual change isn't really being put on full display. Well, how does the series get around this problem? Well, for starters, Bill's domination over Gravity Falls begins at the end of episode 37 and remains until episode 41. This gives the final 4-parter of the series plenty of time to showcase the exact threat Bill poses. With a few exceptions earlier in the series, we've really only been told Bill is a big threat rather than shown it, which isn't really helped by having the least menacing name ever. This meant these final 4 episodes had to do the legwork to make us fear Bill, and simultaneously have our characters win in a way that didn't diminish him as a threatening foe. To recap it briefly, from overpowering Ford and Dipper, burning the notebooks that were vital to Season 1 and 2's plot, transforming into a giant tentacled monster, and eviscerating the authority who literally govern the fabric of time, all with relative ease might I add, this arc could not have done a better job at this. However, while this portrayal is certainly good in terms of tension, doing this is a bit of a double-edged saber. Portraying your villains as too powerful runs the risk of needing to nerf them in some way due to there being no theoretical possibility that this demon is defeated by a bunch of humans. So when watching the finale, my curiosity concerning Bill's defeat skyrocketed, and the final 30 seconds of the penultimate episode played no small part in leaving us to wonder, how could they possibly defeat Bill? And having just rewatched the finale, I can't stress enough how well Somewhere in the Woods gets around this. Firstly, because of a barrier that prevents him from expanding his reach, Bill can't just wipe out all the heroes, which at least gives us a logical reason as to why said heroes are even alive long enough to take desperate actions in the first place. All consecutive moments of struggle, such as Dipper using his magic torch to escape their entrapment, or Mabel prolonging their distraction with her grappling hook, to me, is more of a reflection on Dipper and Mabel's ingenuity and teamwork, rather than Bill's threat levels. And even then, not even a few minutes pass before he catches them anyway, which is a nice segue into his defeat at the hands of Stan and Ford. Bill was always presented as a single-minded guy who is rarely at a disadvantage when at odds with anyone. This, in combination with the subdued nature of all his opponents, makes his confidence all the more understandable, and since right before Ford, or Stan in disguise, agrees to their deal, Bill implies what little he knows about each character's interpersonal relationships is based on what's directly in front of him. So I think it makes perfect sense that he didn't suspect something was up when Stan and Ford bickered. From our and Bill's perspective, Stan and Ford disagreeing could not be more in character of them, and once he enters Stan's mind, we understand why it's all over for him, because the series already notified us of the rules of demons and mind invasion. Bill's defeat wasn't due to just being inferior, but was rather a result of numerous variables he could not have possibly predicted, which, having said all that, is why I believe Gravity Falls ticks this box without a shadow of a doubt. Let's hope the same can be said after I discuss the conclusions each character got. There are many characters I could cover in Gravity Falls, but for this video I just want to analyse 4, those being Dipper, Mabel, Stan and Ford. Dipper and Mabel have both been the face of the series since the start, so let's begin with them. What both seasons depict really well is how far their personalities, and by extension their flaws, juxtapose one another, which resultantly drives the core relationship conflict between them. Dipper is so centered on his own interests, particularly resolving mysteries and impressing others. He doesn't realize the extent to which he's neglecting the healthy relationships he already has. In many episodes across both seasons, Time Traveler's Pig, Summerween, The Deep End, and Sock Opera just to name a few, his unyielding desire ends up having a harmful effect on those close to him, especially Mabel. And even though by the end of most one-episode conflicts, he eventually prioritizes the needs of others, his obvious reluctance to do so elucidates the fact that his overarching desire hasn't changed. He still wants to grow up, to at long last feel good enough, which to him is becoming a hero/adventurer. Mabel's flaw, on the other hand, is her struggle to accept the inevitability of change. She's never known how to let go of what makes her happy. Her affectionate personality aligns with her tendency to cling to other people and places, no matter how naive it may seem. So while both may mirror each other with their fueled obsession, Dipper is too fixated on what he could potentially do in the future, as opposed to fully considering the bigger picture in the past and present, whereas Mabel is too fixated on what she already knows and loves based on the past, which, in turn, discourages her from accepting or adapting to change both in the present and for future. Everything I've just said is put on full display in the fifth last episode, Dipper and Mabel versus the Future, where Dipper is offered an apprenticeship with the person he's always dreamed to be like, but at the expense of being separated from Mabel, who, conversely, experiences nothing but the feeling of her dreams being crushed. Now more than ever, Dipper is Mabel's emotional anchor, so when she learns he won't be returning home with her, her idealism gets the better of her, and she subsequently runs away in devastation. I mention all this because while Dipper and Mabel's relationship wasn't always perfect, most negative effects that were a direct result of them got resolved in the same episode. The same cannot be said in this case, as Mabel is then manipulated into giving Bill the rift device that allows him to reign over Gravity Falls up until his defeat. So, having finally caught up with Weirdmageddon, how is their spiritual journey handled? For starters, part 1 didn't really do anything for Mabel other than lay the foundation for where she's at in the following episode. As for her brother, Dipper is shown to be suffering from the rain which he indirectly caused. A strong example of this is him losing the 3 books that acted as a symbol for his future aspirations, and how they differ to the needs of those around him. As even though in universe he still would have gone out his way to rescue Mabel, it's fitting how shortly after he loses said symbols of his desired future, he sets out to find Mabel ASAP. This time, he will be there for her, which is evident from the episode's end and reinforced in part 2. Despite Dipper being at odds with almost everyone for most of the episode's run, his actions could not have been less selfish, as despite everyone in Mabelland siding against him for his awareness of reality, Dipper was relentless. He prioritised his sister so much, to the point where he risked getting himself banished back to Bill's reign. All of this just at the chance of getting through to his sister and bringing her home. As the episode reaches its climax, Dipper proves that he not only recognises her fears of accepting reality and growing up, but also how he's also too caught up in a fantasy of his own by taking Ford's apprenticeship. What makes this sibling resolution even more powerful is how Dipper directly counters denial as a solution to real life problems, by telling and showing us how they've always dealt with horrible memories in the past, just by being there for each other. This adds an additional layer of the already high amount of empathy we feel, as it confirms that not just during the series' 2 months time span, but for their whole lives, Dipper has been the one person always there for her. Ironically, this aspect ends up being the root of their friction, as well as the solution to it. It was Mabel's close bond with Dipper that drove her to bury her head in her own fantasies, and it's through this bond she's convinced to finally face her fear of growing up, and thereby reject her fantasies that stem from delusion, in a way that feels earned after all the adventures they've been on. And with their final sibling hug mirroring the first episode, both of their series-long journeys have come to a close. If my recap was any indication, this series did an excellent job at setting up the intertwined journeys of these two. The constant reminder of what makes them different allows us to imagine how a hypothetical worse outcome could affect these two. So in scenes when either sibling expresses dread, our subconscious fear of a worse outcome might have put some viewers in their shoes, which can only add to any empathy felt. What also works in the show's favour is, by wrapping up their journeys in the third last episode, this gives the story plenty of time to solidify their healthier bond outside of the episode itself. Their speech to inspire the other survivors to fight back against Bill, their reliance on each other's capabilities when running from Bill, and that heartbreaking epilogue where they travel beyond the horizon, further proves that their support for each other will remain strong, and that they'll literally be there with each other till the ends of the earth. The last point regarding Dipper and Mabel I'd like to address is the lessons that their flaws teach. The themes of embracing change and the importance of connection, while being communicated in a consistent and creative way, are themes that almost anyone can resonate with. While kids have the additional fear of the unknown concerning how they'll adapt to growing up, Theoretically, almost anyone of any age can find navigating certain challenges of life not just difficult, but sometimes even demoralizing. Dipper and Mabel's story was remarkably handled. We're frequently shown their respective similarities and differences, they're both really funny, and their bond reflects that of their uncles, who I'm now going to finally cover. Gruncle Stan and Great Uncle Ford are easily my favourite characters in the series. Although, I'll just let you guys know now that since we only officially meet Ford halfway through the last season, there's not going to be as much to cover about him. Just thought I'd get that out the way. To start with Grunkle Stan, even though he had the occasional heartfelt moment with Dipper and Mabel in Season 1, most episodes used him to tell the comedic side story that had little to no impact on the plot as a whole. So while his care for Dipper and Mabel was hinted at enough, it's the episode A Tale of Two Stans where his growth really gained some momentum. For starters, this episode perfectly illustrates the caring side of him that he rarely shows, as despite Dipper, Mabel and Soooo's suspicions on what Stan, the guy who's known for having questionable ethics, is building under the Mystery Shack, they realise their doubts were misplaced when Stan reveals he spent 30 years trying to get his brother back. It is then after Ford's arrival through the portal where the episode delves into Stan's past. We learn of his unbreakable brotherly bond, his desire to become an adventurer, how his academic levels contrasted his brother's, and most importantly, we learn that his huge insecurity is everyone viewing him as inadequate. His twin brother was the one person who accepted his adventurous mindset, the one person who didn't disregard him just because he wasn't a great student. The only thing Stan feels like he can do well is something done alongside his twin brother. This insecurity is only amplified after Stan accidentally costs Ford's dream career and is rejected by his father, mother, but even more gut-punchingly, his brother. Having just lost the only people he's ever had, Stan seeks validation in the form of proving his family wrong by searching for a well-paid career. On top of that, when he talks about not returning home, he adds, "till I proved I could make something of myself." This tells me he doesn't disagree with everyone's verdict on him. He never denies the questionable things he does because deep down, he's always had that feeling of low self-worth and lack of motivation. But it was only after so many screw-ups that these symptoms became the basis of his mindset for the next decade. The last bit of Stan's origin is his brief reunion with his brother. When Ford mysteriously asks Stan to come meet him, we understand why Stan accepts, as to him, this is a glimmer of hope that he'll get his supporting brother back, as without Ford, he's lost. Unfortunately, upon Ford reminding him of the boat they planned on sailing around the world in, only to then quickly follow that up with the line, "sail as far away as you can," Stan's hope to forget the past and reconnect with his brother is shut down in an instant, because he feels that Ford has once again left him behind due to his research. When Stan tries to destroy a part of Ford's research, the very thing that tore them apart a decade ago, Ford ends up in another dimension. This leaves Stan at his lowest point, as at least when his father cast him out, he knew Ford was alive and continuing his research, what interested him and stuff. But after their reunion, Stan doesn't even know if his brother's alive. The irony of Stan taking action against what drove a metaphorical rift between him and his brother, being the very action which resulted in a literal rift to leave them further apart for far longer, does wonders at highlighting the tragic nature of this event, as essentially, even after a decade, Stan has repeated his cycle of depression. How it only took one overreaction to tear his family apart. How it only took another one to tear him apart from his emotional pillar forever, or so he thought. And the guilt he held for 30 years, just at the possibility his brother might come back to him. And even when he succeeds in his 30-year quest, his ambition to reconnect is yet again shoved aside by Ford, who's still more concerned with the ramifications of his research, to the point where he doesn't even thank Stan. His brother not even understanding the therapeutic significance that a mere act of appreciation can have feeds Stan's fear of low self-worth. If the guy he spent half of his life trying to save can't accept him, then from his perspective, who can? Instead of resorting to violence, however, this time Stan surprises Ford with his level of care for Dipper and Mabel by asking him to prioritise their safety over his own, while also giving Ford an idea of how much pain he has gone through when he refers to his niece and nephew as the only family he has left. As the series up to this point has shown us, Dipper and especially Mabel are the only ones who have ever valued Stan as a person. They're the only ones who care about what he has to say, even in spite of his occasional uncaring demeanour. I won't note every way in which these two mirror Dipper and Mabel, but what I will say is how well Stan's fear of repeating the cycle is conveyed when he tells Ford to stay away from the kids. While this might seem possessive at first, thanks to all the background info provided by this episode, this strongly suggests that Stan's next biggest fear is someone close to him going through the mental torment that he did. He knows how easy it is to tear a seemingly unbreakable bond apart. His strong desire for connection is embodied by Mabel, whereas his brother's fixation on his ambitions that make his actions come across as insensitive is the same flaw that Dipper overcame. Wow, that was a lot of time spent on just one episode. Well, for being a masterclass in pretty much every way, it deserves it. But now we must ask ourselves, was all this exciting setup worth it in the end? To skip ahead to the penultimate episode, this is where it all goes to hell. Bill is trying to force Ford to grant him access to the rest of the world, and this leads to Dipper and Mabel to convince everyone else to work together to help Ford and defeat Bill once and for all. Everyone except Stan, who still holds Ford's lack of empathy against him, which causes him to take a stance and show no empathy at all. From his perspective, not only his life, but the lives of those in Gravity Falls have been damaged, possibly beyond repair, because of Ford's priorities not aligning with his own. Because of Weirdmageddon, the physical rift that allowed Bill, Ford's former associate, to ensue chaos on his home, has widened the already unstable rift between Stan and his brother. Now, as heartbreaking as that is, we're shown Stan isn't a complete selfish jerk. He goes out of his way to join the infiltration team to find Ford, although him going into the heart of Bill's fortress might be a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, it proves he still really cares for his brother, but on the other hand, as the scene after implies, he views helping the frozen townsfolk and his brother as a method of proving himself and, providing that sense of emotional validation. But maybe, just maybe, Ford will value him. His line, "Good to see you too, bro," supports this, as it's exactly what he first said to Ford before accidentally losing him for another 3 decades. The scene that follows is where Stan's insecurities show up in full force. The world is on the line, but because of all the pain he's gone through, his desperation for appreciation reaches its peak, to the degree where he only agrees to help save the day after his brother says thank you. Which he obliges to. All is good, right? Wrong. As hinted earlier, Ford is the only person who in Stan's mind he's done anything good for. So to have that person only say thank you reluctantly, and then proceed to present their superior intellect by nitpicking Stan's grammar of all things, fuels his low self-worth. He'll always be nothing, right? So why should he even bother? It's this squabble that gives Bill the upper hand at the start of the final episode. Just because he couldn't take another strike at the heart, now everyone's at risk. This is where we get the exchange we've all been waiting for. Having just witnessed the disastrous impact his actions had on others outside his family, for once, Stan openly takes the blame. He doesn't hide his internal demons or deflect fault to his brother. His lifelong dread of being a screw-up and nothing else completely haunts him. He failed his dad, he failed his brother twice, and now he's failed the galaxy. This matters because in showing Ford how consumed by trauma he's been for most of his life, they have their first friendly conversation in decades. The back and forth consideration Stan and Ford express to each other, alongside the few criticisms made, only targeted towards themselves, not the other, confirms that deep down, Stan's number one characteristic wasn't the self-centered attitude we were introduced to. It was his desire for, and before this point, a lack of emotional belonging that drove him. This overdue acceptance from his brother comforts him enough to where he's willing to sacrifice all his memories if it wipes out Bill, which I also interpret as him subtly opening up about his insecurities to his brother, but that's just me. And it is after this scene where Stan's arc culminates wonderfully. Everyone who took their cruel behaviour out on Stan was proven wrong by this singular act of self-sacrifice. His whole life he's been given little choice but to look out for himself. But after his desire for approval was fulfilled in the slightest, he immediately takes the opportunity to make things right for the greater good. Without being asked to, Stan puts his family above himself. Not the old family that threw him out like garbage. Not the community that discriminated him and his brother, no. But the newfound family that believed in him, as well as the community of people in Gravity Falls who valued his museum for 30 years. After destroying Bill, the demon who's literally invading his mind, he ultimately relieves himself of the spiritual demon of inadequacy that's plagued him his whole life, by embracing the fact that he was good for something after all. Now, a common criticism I've heard about the conclusion of Stan's journey is how he gets his memories back quickly, thus cutting the heartbreak kinda short. I understand where this is coming from, and it's possible the ending still could have packed a punch if Stan lost his memories permanently, but to be honest, I don't mind this at all. When Stan and Ford go on an adventure of a lifetime, it acts as the payoff for what their origin story set up, and thus assures us that both of their respective journeys have come full circle. Both of them genuinely chose to make amends. Both of them wanted to fulfill their childhood dreams. In terms of what was shown on screen, I'd argue this decision is just a tiny bit more important to Stan. Not saying it isn't important to Ford whatsoever, it totally is, but I'd argue, it's a bit more impactful from Stan's perspective because, even after 10 years of being away from his brother, it's implied he still had a desire to, achieve the dream with Ford of going on an adventure of a lifetime. It was Ford's rejection of this idea after the said 10-year-long separation that pushed Stan over the edge. So, what I'm trying to get at is, Stan, even as an adult, still craved this adventure. Without any memories of this desire, their teamwork shown in the epilogue might come across as a little less genuine, and that's assuming this beautiful bookend with them achieving their dreams even happens at all. As if Stan did lose his memories permanently, he'd have no recollection of their dream in the first place, nor how much he's gone through to earn it. So when Ford asks, for another chance, and, asks to go on an adventure with not anyone, but Stan specifically, Stan wouldn't understand why those words are so meaningful to him. So yeah, I'm overall satisfied in spite of Stan getting his memories back, because the conclusion that followed legitimized it. His first direct conversation with his brother, while they're not in the midst of danger, his goodbye to Dipper and Mabel, and especially the final shot of him and his brother taking on perilous obstacles together, could not have delivered a more heartwarming end to Grunkle Stan's arc. Moreover, I appreciate that not once does the series take sides, it acknowledges how both Stan and Ford are flawed in their own way, and that they've both got to change. An excellent example of this is when Stan accidentally pushes Ford into another dimension. Now, did he overreact? Yes, absolutely. But the scene, along with the episode that follows, don't portray Ford as some flawless role model. It doesn't gloss over the fact that his unempathetic nature is what causes him to push others away, just because he doesn't think about the mental effect it would have on them. It's this cold attitude that drives his brother and partner away. It's the same thing that drives the rift between Dipper and Mabel when he offers Dipper an apprenticeship. And it's because of this same cold attitude that he and Stan bicker, which almost costs them the entire galaxy. Likewise, if my dissection of Stan's character didn't make it obvious, neither of them crossed the line of being unreasonable. Even when I disagreed with a couple of their actions, I always understood where they were coming from. Ford's cold nature is shown as being a byproduct of his immeasurable fixation on his research, and later the repercussions of said research could have on a large scale. which is the flaw that Dipper inherits. It is only after his cold attitude puts the galaxy on the line that he, along with Stanley, openly admit their faults and work together to take down Bill. Ford's arc is then brought to a close side by side with Stan's when he proves he finally understands the psychological impact its outward behaviour can have by asking Stanley to join him on the adventure they've always dreamed of. In short, wrapping up both their arcs in the same scene serves as a neat metaphor for the revived state of their brotherhood. One benefit that Stan's characterization has on the series as a whole that I just want to bring up is the rewatch value it provides. For the first 25 episodes out of 40, we knew next to nothing about Stan's inner goals. All we got were a couple teasers that something was going on underneath the mystery shack. But now that we have the full context surrounding him, his brother, and the base of operations from season 1, that additional context changes how we retroactively perceive events in those previous 25 episodes. For example, when first watching the second episode, the scenes involving Stan sitting in a boat called the Stanowar, all alone, sure made us feel bad for him, but it's only on rewatch where our empathy skyrockets, because now we know the emotional significance that that name, and by extension that boat, has to him, as that's the same name given to a boat he and Ford found as kids. This recontextualization also amplifies the emotional impact felt during Stan and Ford's final scene in the boat, because now we are aware of the full meaning of the name, Stanowar 2. It's an additional metaphor for their enduring bond. And it doesn't fall into the trap that other mystery reveals fall into, where it has us confused and querying the story up until that point. Cars 2, the Star Wars prequel trilogy. In terms of themes present, an uplifting prospect that Stan and Ford convey, even more so than Dipper and Mabel, is that no matter how different your personalities or aspirations are, no matter how long you've been physically or emotionally apart, that never has to define the quality of your relationship. And furthermore, no matter how much psychological tension there is between you, the chance to make amends will never permanently go away. Stan and Ford mending their ties in spite of their almost non-existent brotherhood for over half their life demonstrates this. It also teaches the lesson of a balanced mentality towards oneself. It's okay to admit your flaws and screw-ups, while also not letting them drag your life and potentially the lives of others into misery. Stan still admitted in the end he wasn't using his mind for much, as was also visually shown in it being a desolate white void, but he learned in the end that that doesn't automatically determine where his life will end up. I think that's quite an uplifting message to both kids and adults alike. Long story short, Chronicle Stan was a borderline perfect character. He's four-dimensional, with all these flaws and hopes, he's surrounded with a lot of mystery, and he is one of the funniest cartoon characters I have ever had the pleasure of listening to. And credit where credit is due, for a character who was only in like a third of the series, Ford's origins, interests and his own flaws were all fleshed out really well. Overall, I couldn't be happier with all the conclusions each of these four received, so it ticks this box without a question. And with all those deep character dissections done and dusted, I'm going to finish my assessment on Gravity Falls by looking at how the series portrays the final fates of the characters. This section is going to be the shortest in the whole video, and it's not even close. That's because every character we've grown to recognise, at worst, has a cameo to show that they're alright after Bill's rule. Yeah, I mean, there's little to no ambiguity surrounding really anyone. I mean, just to, take a look at the main cast. Dipper, Mabel and Models, heading back home to California. Stan and Ford, on an adventure in the Arctic Ocean. Soooo, the new manager of the Mystery Shack. Wendy, she's just living her life as normal in Gravity Falls. Etc, etc. Something else I want to praise the epilogue for is, it even giving secondary and cameo characters closure. Like getting confirmation that the Manitors, Gnomes, Multibear, Octavian, Melody, Comic Relief Cops, among many others, are all alive and well, adds this sense of completeness. As even the briefest appearance gives off the idea that the central protagonists aren't the only ones thriving. And also, furthermore, since we get a look at Bill's physical corpse, the thought of any, future bloodshed doesn't enter our minds. Which is why I fundamentally believe Gravity Falls passes this part of the checklist, as well as the criteria for what makes a resolved ending work. Overall, the ending of Gravity Falls Season 2 excelled on so many levels, and in my opinion is one of the best animated endings I have ever watched. Without further delay, let's shift this analysis towards an ending that didn't work for me as much. The Arcane series finale, titled The Dirt Under Your Nails, while not a bad episode by any means, made so many decisions that left me confused. For the rest of this video, I'm going to take an in-depth look into the same 3 aspects I did with Gravity Falls. For context, Season 1's plot was all about the class divide between the thriving city of Piltover and the rough underground that's Zaun. Almost every character is introduced as a result of this conflict. Vi and Powder are on a mission to steal from Piltover because of the rough nature of Zaun. Jace and Victor only get the chance to develop Heztech because of this mission. Caitlyn's idea to investigate the underground stems from the current conflict between the 2 cities. Echo would not have formed a team of Firelights had the conflict not existed in the first place. And once Topside realise that the people of Zaun have access to Heztech weapons, they get worried and send a strike force consisting of Vi and Jace to minimise the threat. Another facet I want to bring up is how almost every single interpersonal relationship is formed because of this class divide. Silco and Vander's ideological differences on how to improve Zaun, Vander's father-esque role to Vi and Powder, Vi and Caitlyn's bond, Jace and Victor's work on Heztech in an attempt to help those of the underground, you get it. So going into Season 2, I figured the moment when Jinx blasts the Piltover Council would be the catalyst for the abundance of suffering to come. How tragic is that? The actions of one person undid the peace that was just about to be declared, and now a full-on battle is going to start, right? Well, the season does start out strong this way. The first episode does an excellent job at showing us how all the characters deal with the psychological pain endured by trauma. Vi blames herself for the actions of her sister, Kate's dealing with the loss of her mother. We're shown the differing views between the surviving council members on how to respond to this attack. Mel is hesitant to respond with aggression. Sallow seems more concerned with personal vengeance rather than what's good for the people of Piltover. And for the following few episodes, Vi and Kate lead a strike force to find Jinx, even if it means using chemical weapons to achieve this goal. All these examples, in my opinion, enhance the story because not only are they built around the conflict, but they're also personal for most, if not all, the characters. How does the underground respond to all this? Well, we don't really know because after a quick montage in episode 3 of Vi and Kate cleaning up Zaun, whatever that means, and some Zaunites getting captured at a rally only to be later freed by Jinx at the end of episode 4, that's it. The conflict between Piltover and Zaun takes a complete backseat until episode 9. And even then, when some of the Zaunites do pop up in the finale, it was only after I paused and thought for a few minutes that it crossed my mind that this conflict hadn't been addressed for over half the season. To me, this is a sign that the season glossed over arguably one of its more interesting aspects in favour of Ambessa wanting to conquer Piltover just cause, and Victor turning into Arcane's less intimidating version of Ultron. Sure, I do agree with the message that Victor's arc sends. Fixing imperfections isn't necessarily the perfect solution to living, but I feel like both his and Ambessa's role in the story not only lacked the ideal time necessary for me to fully appreciate their motives, but it also takes away from the conflict that I was already invested in. What might be the biggest bone I have to pick with the series is how this class conflict is resolved. Okay, sure, I'm a bit disappointed with how Acts 2 and 3 didn't really do their job, but that doesn't mean the finale can't still at least resolve the backseated conflict in some meaningful way. But it didn't. When Jace asks Zaun to help them against Ambessa at the start of the finale, at first they don't really seem to care, which is understandable. But for no obvious reason, Zaun swoops in to help defeat Ambessa and Victor. And look, as awesome of a moment as that was, all it does is leave me scratching my head pondering why the series didn't feel the need to explore this deep-rooted conflict. This is only made worse after Ambessa and Ultron Victor are defeated, as all we get is a brief snippet of Piltover meeting halfway with Zaun, and then Sevica joining the Piltover Council. Is that it? Have all the deep-rooted issues between the two sides been forgiven? Remember those montages of Kate and Vi cleaning up Zon using chemical warfare? What happened to the Zon Council shown in episode 2? Do none of the Zonites have anything to say regarding Piltover's neglect of their rough living circumstances for, I think, at least a few decades? Yeah, I know, I get resolving class conflict isn't something, that's easy to do in one scene. But I'd argue that a scene that conveys their social amendments could go a long way. Even if it's just something like activity-based, like a shared party between the two. So when Sevoka is put on the council, it's easier for us to infer that the people of both sides were able to make amends through just simply interacting with each other. To be honest, I think I just would have preferred anything more than what little we got. Overall, this season's resolution to the overarching plot didn't fail on every level. I mean, the idea of resolving this class conflict is where I wanted the series to end up, but it's just the way it was handled through the season unfortunately led to the resolution received in the finale to fall short on this principle. Now, moving on to characters, like with Gravity Falls, there are so many characters I could talk about in this series, so I chose to narrow it down to 3: Jinx, Vi, and Kate. Jinx is my favourite character across both seasons, so let's start with her. The depth surrounding how she deals with her trauma and low self-worth was so powerful. Similarly to Grunkle Stan, when one person she thought she could trust with the world abandoned her, her guilt and clinginess to Silco, the one person who valued her for who she was, consumed her. So when we caught up with her at the start of the season, her unintentionally killing Silco reinforces her insecurity that she's nothing but a Jinx. Her losing that emotional anchor feeds the self-thought that she's not capable of doing anything right. Her refusing to act as a symbol for the people of the Undercity in the 2nd and 4th episodes is evidence of this. Her lust for connection is why her relationship with Isha is so important to her arc. She sees so much of her younger self in Isha, and due to how most of her trauma is rooted from how others, including her older sister, treated her when she was Isha's age, she doesn't want the same thing that happened to her to happen to someone who embodies a younger version of herself. On top of this, Jinx taking the older sister role gives her the chance to break the cycle of sibling betrayal that started all the way back with Vander and Silco, and was then later repeated by Vi. Another thing I want to mention about Isha is the emotional effect her continued relationship has on Jinx. For someone who deems herself to be worthless, the fact that a kid looks up to you so much to the point where she'll go out of her way to shield you from a punch has to mean something, right? Throughout Act 2, there are numerous instances that give us a good look at Jinx's more compassionate side, like when without hesitation she embraces her role as an older sister by freeing Isha, or liberating all the other Zonites, or seeking out Vi to help track down mutated Vander, which then goes on to mend her wounds engulfed by the literal loss of her father and figurative loss of her sister. However, her mental stability takes a complete 180 when Isha sacrifices herself to stop mutated Vander and Ambessa's forces. What makes her depressed mindset even more sad is the fact that we know her belief that there's no good version of herself to be wrong thanks to episode 7. This episode takes advantage of it being set in an alternate timeline, as by showing the audience how one small change could have made things so much greater, it intensifies the feeling of heartbreak, knowing that all of the suffering Jinx went through could have been avoided, and that there's a Jinx out there who doesn't think of herself as a burden to others. Back in the present, Jinx has no hope that things can turn around for her. From her perspective, that ship sailed with Vi, Silco, and now Isha. So come the finale, how does the series resolve this constant back and forth of self-hate? Well, when she tries to kill herself for the 6th time, Echo, her childhood friend who had just come back from the alternate timeline where there is a good version of her, finally gets her to stop when he challenges Jinx's biggest insecurity with the line, "It's never too late to build something new. Someone worth building it for," which gives her hope that she isn't all destructive. While all this character work is amazing, this is an endings analysis, so how did the series fare on that front? In short, I mostly love how her story ends. Her new colour scheme, her rocking tunes, and her care for Vi all do a phenomenal job at telling us that the new life she's built herself is a mixture of the positive aspects of Powder and Jinx respectively. And this brings us to her quote-unquote death. This mirrors her at the start of the episode, but this time instead of killing herself out of depression, she sacrifices herself for her sister, the person she's felt like a burden to since their initial fallout, and die with their mutated father, the very person whose death her actions indirectly led to in the first place. I also find it poetic that the only two people who believed in her whole life, Vi and Echo, were there when she was about to die at the start and end of the episode. My only problem with Jinx's conclusion is how the depressing song that plays when she tries to take her own life is repeated here. I don't know, I kinda would have preferred it if a more uplifting song was used, to sort of signify the thematic difference between her actions at the start and end of the episode. Yeah, I know, the act of her dying is still sad in itself, but the depressing song that played as she sacrifices herself, I just don't think really portrays the best message to its audience. I don't know, I feel something just with a slightly different tune would go a long way in showing us that at least in the moment of her quote-unquote death, Jinx is more at peace. She's not destroying what she hates, she's saving what she loves. Despite my little frustration, that musical theme was only a small blemish on an otherwise good enough conclusion to her arc though. How do the other characters compare? Yeah, about that. Now it's Vi's turn. Vi's flaw this season is that she can't deal with change. She just cannot move on from those she cares about. This is why she's so stressed about Kate, the one person left in her life in Act 1, changing due to her own grief. This is also why when she has the chance to kill Jinx in episode 3, she just can't do it. The same person who's been telling herself that she needs to stop Jinx no matter what, can't bring herself to kill her own sister. A bittersweet irony of this hesitation is by not moving on from her younger sister, Kate moves on from Vi, leaving Vi to seek out the only thing she knows, fighting and drinking her pain away. All this anguish at the start of episode 5 worked for me, and then having her wounds healed by mutated Vander, the father figure who she undoubtedly cared for, was really beautiful. An issue others have pointed out is despite this beautiful reunion between Vi and Jinx, all of their lingering issues completely vanish into thin air. Like yeah, I'm alright with them reuniting because of Vander, like that's fair game, and I don't mind most of their issues being resolved, but like all of them? I don't know, I just feel a scene of slight hesitation to trust each other, or a reminder of the horrible things Jinx did, i.e. causing the mother of Vi's love interest to die, would have made it feel a bit better paced. But we're never really shown that side of their relationship get resolved. And besides making up with Kate, which I'll cover in her section, we don't really get much development from Vi. It's only right at the end of the finale where we get something from her. In spite of Jinx telling her that Vander is gone, Vi's compassion for those she cares about gets the better of her. She can't leave the mutated form of who she thinks is her father behind. This forces Jinx to ram both herself and mutated Vander off the platform. And Vi does what we'd expect of her and grabs onto Jinx, resulting in Jinx letting go in order to not drag Vi down with her. While I've already talked about this in Jinx's section, how does this gut-punching moment reflect on Vi? What lessons will she learn from this? Well, we don't know, because literally all we get from her is a scene with the word rushed written all over it, where she confirms to Kate that she's in this fight with her. You know, because like that's something new that the audience had never picked up on. Vi's journey, while not awful by any means, was just underdeveloped, so much so that I had to skip over a third of the season simply because it just doesn't do much with her. I still like her character, but after talking about all the Gravity Falls characters and Jinx for so long, it's annoying I don't have more to say about Vi, other than what we're basically shown in the season's first half, and also taking into account her trauma both in episodes 1 and 5 being mostly forgotten about. Anyway, we still got one more character to cover, so let's get this section over with by mentioning Caitlyn. Like Vi, she's also dealing with trauma in Act 1, but unlike Vi, it's because of the death of her mother, which is something that Vi can totally empathise with. Across these 3 episodes, she's shown to be increasingly consumed by her lust for vengeance. There's even this dark dream where she's surrounded by nothing but a barren grey environment with purple flowers falling everywhere as she takes aim at Jinx. And I say increasingly worse because it gets to the point where she's willing to put a child at risk if it means avenging her mother. This then leads to her and Vi's breakup, and morally speaking, she's at her lowest point. Now, just like with the plot direction, it's acts 2 and 3 where a big problem arises. I'm more than happy with her helping Vi in episode 6. She'd be a bit of a hypocrite to not help Vi with her father after she had just lost her mother, but all of her hatred directed towards Jinx is just shoved aside like that. Like, Jinx still tore Kate away from her mother, and has ensued so much chaos to get to this point. Literally all we get is a 40-second scene of her scolding Jinx in episode 8, and that's it. The finale is just her fighting Ambessa. Not a bad thing in a vacuum, but the fact that the finale was more interested in using her in battle sequences rather than resolving her psychological battles just underwhelmed me. I don't know what messages her story is trying to convey by the end, because as it stands, her story wasn't finished. I just want to emphasize this, that season 2 doesn't ruin any of these characters. I'm just a bit disappointed with how their journeys come to, or in some cases, fail to come to, a satisfying resolution. Before wrapping up, there's one more question to ask ourselves. Does the story provide certainty regarding the fates of the characters? I'm not sure if I phrased this the best in prior sections, but when I say certainty, I also mean in an emotional sense, like we know how to feel when a certain character dies, like it's not just glossed over. And you know, the character's acknowledgement of said death will impact this as well. In the Arcane finale's case, it could not fail at this in like any more of a spectacular way. Like yeah, sure, at least a couple of the surviving characters like Vi and Kate are obviously alright. Zevika's on the council now, which, as rushed as it feels, is still enough to assure me that she's okay. Bessa dies right in front of us, so I guess she gets a pass. But the ambiguity surrounding pretty much every other character left me scratching my head beyond belief. First, let's cover Jinx. I didn't really want to bring this up in her character section, but when the series ended with that final shot of a random ship, I was so confused I decided to Google its meaning. And apparently, it's the same ship from the start of the series that Powder said she'd fly one day. So I guess this is implying she's got her wish? But all this does is make me question the resolution of her arc so much to the point where I kinda just don't want to go into it. I said this previously in the video, but confusions such as these could arguably detract from the sense of resolution that series finales should be trying to convey. So I'm just gonna move on. What happened to Jace and Victor? Are they dead? I don't know. How do the other characters who befriended them feel? I don't know. I mean, Mel and Kate were shown to be quite close to Jace. Did they not care that he presumably sacrificed himself? Additionally, in Season 1, Jace was the third most important character behind Vi and Jinx, so having no one address him or Victor's fate bewilders our preconceived notion that they even mattered at all. What about Heimerdinger from episode 7? Is he dead? He was the founder of the city who was unfairly outcast in season 1. The fact that he was pivotal in sending Echo back to the main timeline, which ended up helping in the final battle, to me, is enough for him to at least deserve a statue of recognition, or something. What's up with Mel now? Is she going back to Noxus? If so, why? I don't know. Her storyline this season was hard enough to keep up with, to be honest. I may have touched upon this earlier, but the most common criticism towards the season was that it was rushed, and that's especially felt in this final episode. I mean, the death of one random Jinx supporter seemed to have more of an emotional effect on Vi than Loris, the guy who was there for her when she resorted to fighting and drinking her pain away in episode 1 and 5. Not even Maddie, Kate's temporary love interest revealing herself to be a spy, seemed to have an effect on Kate. Or like, what about Singe? Like, you know, he wanted his daughter for like the whole season, and then, you know, he finally got his daughter back, and then we get like a 5-second glimpse of him, and I could go on. But in conclusion, it just feels like Arcane's ending was more concerned with showing us the end of the plot rather than the characters, which is why Arcane fails to pass this checklist in the end. Arcane Season 2 overall was a good season of TV. The animation was gorgeous, the music was great, the action was mostly stellar. I don't hate the season at all. I was just very disappointed with the way it ended. Anyways, now that that's all done and dusted, thanks for watching everyone.